So my presentation for this conference is called UFOs in Art and History, and it goes hand in hand with the kind of Ancient Alien TV series. So we're going to talk about a lot of that stuff. What I like to do, and I always do it at every conference, is talk about MUFON for a second. And if you take a look at the slide, MUFON was started in 1969, and it was started after the Air Force Project Blue Book, and they said that UFOs were not a threat to national security and that they would no longer investigate UFOs. So that's when private investigators stepped in, and the Mutual UFO Network does the investigations that the Air Force says they don't do. But we know that they do them. And many Air Force officials have come out and said that the Air Force does do investigations if they think it's a threat to national security. So what they said there is true, well, partially true. They said they don't think it's a threat to our national security, but if they think it is, they will do the investigation. So plenty of them are threats. MUFON has 3,000 members worldwide. We have about 900 investigators. This afternoon there was a class next door with, it looked like about 22 people in there. They're all either new field investigators or ones that purchased the manual and going to take the test very shortly. So, and that's good. We always look at add investigators. Here in Pennsylvania, we have 117 members and 29 or 30 investigators. And we're probably number 3 or 4 in the country on the size of our membership, investigators, and the number of cases we get a year. We get almost 1 case a day. It's about 300 a month. So we get 6 cases a week. I guess the extraterrestrials take Sundays off. Not really, but we get about 6 cases a week, you know, and we've gone as high as 350 cases, almost a case every single day, and dipped down to about 290. Now, the interesting thing was a couple of years ago, we were only getting about 95 cases for the whole year. And once we had the big UFO flap in 2008, and people found out who we were and how to report a case, and the TV show was on Discovery Channel, UFOs Over Earth. It gave us a lot of publicity. We started our conferences, and now people know how to report a UFO. And you know, when I'm out on TV shows, radio shows, I do interviews, I always make it clear. They say, well, what's your goal? And my goal is to make it comfortable for people to report a UFO. You know, and that's important, because you don't know how many people call me and I don't want to give my name. I don't want anybody to know who I am because the government's going to track me down. And they're afraid. How can you be afraid when this is a constitutional right to free speech? You shouldn't be afraid to come forward and report a UFO. But yeah, you have to credit the CIA. They've done a very good job since 1953 to debunk this whole phenomenon and make it silly where people laugh. I don't run into one person when they ask me, oh, how's retirement? I just retired a couple months ago in May. I don't run into one person that when they say, oh, what are you doing in your retirement? I said, well, I just wrote a UFO book, and I run 2 conferences. I'm going to do my 3rd up in Erie a year. And you see the little Bill Clinton smirk. You know how when he's the talking, you knew he was lying. He had that little smirk in his eye and his lip, and it's the same thing, you know. And I think I've lost more girlfriends over this than anything, but that's just the way it goes. So that's one of the hazards of ufology, is you're not going to get a date. Or not one that lasts, let's say. You can see from the chart, we were getting, as a group, not just Pennsylvania, about 150 cases a month and 1,500 a year. And that has shot up to 500. We're even getting 600 a month now on an average, and about 6,000 cases a year. So, you know, we say there's about 10,000 sightings a year out there. Newfork probably gets about 3,000, 4,000 of those cases. And then you have all of the independent ufologists. So there might be maybe 12,000 cases out there a year. So MUFON gets about half of all the UFO cases. So here's my presentation. It's called, this is Art and UFOs, but I renamed it UFOs in Art and History. So let's talk about this. I stole that off the internet. I shouldn't say that because I'm being recorded. So, all right, here, what I'm showing you right here is really a document, not a document, but the wording from a document. In the Air Force from 1968 to 1970, They taught a Physics 370 class to their cadets in Colorado Springs, and they taught it for 3 years. And what's important is, I mentioned Project Blue Book. It ended in 1969, December. January, they had their hearing on it of 70. So once they said they were no longer, UFOs were not a threat and they wouldn't investigate them, at the end of 70, the Air Force pulled this class from their physics training with their cadets. And it's funny, 2 of my cousins went to the Air Force Academy. One was a navigator, supposed to be a navigator for the space shuttle. And I asked them about this because they went in mid-late 70s, and they hadn't heard of this. But basically the course says, and I think that what the paragraph you're looking at right there is the opening paragraph, and it says, according to the Air Force, UFOs have been visiting the Earth for as long as 47,000 years. Okay? So just think about that. When people ask you or ask me about UFOs, well, I refer to the Air Force physics class that says that they've been visiting Earth for as long as 47,000 years, and there are 3 or 4 different species. That's what it says. I have a copy of the chapter at home, chapter 33 of their Physics 370 class. So as far as I'm concerned, that's the facts right there. They've been here for really our entire evolution, and there's 3 or 4 species. We'll talk about that a little later. But I want to talk about this course that they taught. And some of the comments that were made in this chapter were, the phenomenon deserves valid scientific study. Also in the chapter, they talk about one of the oldest chronicles we have from India. It's from 6000 BC. It's 8,000 years old, and it's called the Zayan. There's also the Mahabharata that's also 8,000 years old. We'll talk about that a little bit. But I'm going to read some stuff to you because I think it's important, and it's from these texts from India. Who we're not exposed to that in this country. You know, we just don't hear about these things. And the one thing with this ufology is the more I do this, the more I find out. You know, the more I look, the more I find. So this is what it says in they're describing, this is a chapter from the Zayan in India. And this is what they say, quote, "They rose into the air in a huge metal shining vessel. They launched a great shining lance that rode on a beam of light. It burst apart, and a great ball of flame shot up into the heavens. All those in the city were horribly burned. Those that looked upon it were blinded. Those that entered the city became ill and died. When the leader saw what he had done, he gathered his warriors, entered their vessels, and rose one by one into the sky and sailed away, never to return." What does that sound like to you? Sounds like a nuclear war, a nuclear exchange. And we're going to talk more about this because it goes into more detail in the Mahabharata. So here's some other quotes. In this section in their physics book, it talks about secret weapons, abductions, the dangers of contact with a UFO. I mean, it's really great reading. You can Google this stuff and get it and read it. Here's some more quotes. More recently, on July 24th, 1957, Russian anti-aircraft batteries opened fire on UFOs. We too have fired on UFOs. That's page 461. Then they get into a case that they start describing credible cases with ufology. And like I said, it's some of the best reading. I'm going to tell you about the Sutton Farm in Kelly, Kentucky. They describe it. And it says on Sunday evening, August 21st, 1955, 8 adults and 3 children. One of those children will speak for us next year on what happened. She's about 50, so she's going to be one of our speakers. And I just heard her at the MUFON Symposium, did a good job. You know, she's from Kentucky, and we're going to get her up here to tell us about this. And she didn't know that her family's case was documented in this physics book with the Air Force. As a matter of fact, I gave her a couple of sources to add to her presentation about how credible her case was, but it's documented as one of the most credible cases. So it says this Kelly family saw a brightly glowing object settle behind the barn. The family dogs began to bark at a creature wearing a glowing silvery suit and coming toward them. It was 3.5 feet tall, with a large round head and long arms. It had webbed hands and with claws. The Suttons fired a 12-gauge shotgun at close range, knocking down the creature. The creature jumped back up and scrambled away. One of the women were peeking out of the dining room window when she discovered one of the creatures wearing a helmet and a wide slit eyes peeking back at her. She screamed, and the men rushed in and began firing at the creature. It was knocked down, but got up and ran away. The Suttons fired 50 rounds over 20 minutes, and at no time did the creatures fire back. The Suttons' impression was that the creatures were having fun scaring them. So we're going to get one of those 3 kids, who's now probably about 50, to come to the conference and tell the tale of her Sutton family, Kelly family, on the Sutton farm. Okay, here's another quote. One must be guarded against assuming that our knowledge of physics is complete or assume that our physical laws may not be superseded. That's on page 465 of this physics book. And here's their conclusion. Their conclusion was that many witnesses have been reliable people, and it is doubtful that the phenomenon was entirely psychological. This leaves us with the unpleasant possibility of alien visitors. Data suggests that there are 3 and maybe 4 different groups of aliens. It is best to keep an open mind and not take a position on either side of the question. That's what it says. That's the course that our Air Force was teaching the cadets from 1968, 69, and 70. And when you look at the history of ufology, there's no doubt in my mind that we believe it's real. And when you lay it out, in a court of law, we would win. You know, you could lay this case out as being credible, that this is a real phenomenon. So from there, I want to go into the presentation. I think I have, actually I should have been using the PowerPoint here. Here's what the chapter looked like. You see it says the Air Force Manual. You got some of my handwriting on there because this was emailed to me and I printed it out. Colonel Wendell Stevens wrote the chapter. This is chapter 33. You can see unidentified flying objects. And you can see it up top too, starts on page 455. Okay, and there it says that they've been here as long as 47,000 years. So I believe everything the government says, so I believe this document. How's that? So we're going to turn it around on them. It's real. So, and it is real. Okay, in my opinion, the historical record of Earth is full of ongoing paleo contact with UFOs, from oral traditions to cave paintings to petroglyphs to Renaissance paintings to sacred writings. So let's take a look at some of these. And, you know, this is all open to interpretation, obviously. This is a painting from Kosovo from 1350. It's the Crucifixion. It was painted in 1350 in Yugoslavia. It hangs over the altar of the Visoki Dekani Monastery. It shows 2 beings in single craft chasing each other. You see them in the top right and left? They're looking back at each other, and the Soviet magazine Sputnik wrote, besides the fact that both ships have streamlined bodies with clearly visible jets in their wake, and with the saints and the flying machines in positions of pilots, the angels watching the flight covered their eyes and ears and seemed to be backing away out of fear. And skeptics who look at this say that it just represents the sun and moon. Okay, but pretty, I mean, look, it looks like 2 craft to me with pilots in it. Okay, that was in 1350 that was painted. And one's looking back at the other one chasing him. Okay, this painting is from Belgium in 1710. It's actually a carving into a dresser drawer in Belgium, and it depicts Moses receiving the 10 Commandments, and there are 4 objects in the sky that he's receiving it from. It's called the Baptism of Christ. It resides in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, England. It was painted in 1710 by Flemish artist Art de Gelder, who was a student of Rembrandt, and depicts a classic UFO shining beams of light down on John the Baptist. I think that's actually the next one. Hold on a second. There it is. So you see the UFO that was painted in 1710, and it's shining beams down on John the Baptist while he's baptizing Jesus. So you have to wonder, 300 years ago, why are they painting a UFO right? Because my understanding was they painted what they saw back then. You know, it wasn't sci-fi, imaginary things. It was, you put plants out, they paint the plants. You know, that's what they painted, is what they saw. Okay, here's another one from 1600 in Georgia. That's over in Europe, not in the United States. Painted in 1600, you got these mushroom-type things hovering on both sides of the crucifixion. This next one is from 1383 in Florence, Italy. You can see it in the center there. You know, I went to Florence a couple of years ago, and I wish I knew that this was hanging there in the art gallery. I would have went and gone and seen it. Now, what people say, the critics say, that this is nothing more than lenticular clouds, that they're not UFOs. So, you know, like I said, it's up to your interpretation as to, you know, why are they painting it that way? Is it a lenticular cloud or is it a UFO? Okay, this one here is, on the right, is from France in 1338. That was before that we had hot air balloons, but yet somebody paints a hot air balloon hundreds of years before they were invented. The other one is from India also. I mean, it looks like an ET, and it looks like a craft, and that's painted on a cave wall back in 1338. This one's interesting. It's called the Adoration or Annunciation. It was painted by Carlo Crivelli in 1430. It hangs in the National Gallery in London, and it shows a UFO up top, and it's shining a beam of light that goes through the Mary's crown and the dove. Okay, this is called the Madonna or the Shepherd's Vision. It was painted in 1449 by Domenico Ghirlandaio, and is part of the Losa collection in the Palazzo Vecchio. It shows a Madonna and a child and a craft, and if you take a look at it, let me just move on here. You can see that there's a craft in the sky there. There's a mothership there with 3 more of them coming out, similar to the one you saw a couple of slides prior. And then down in the bottom right, you see this guy and his dog there on your bottom left, that would be, looking up at it. And I think it clearly depicts a mothership with UFOs, and this guy's looking up at it, and that was painted in 1400. Okay, this one here, I think I got a pointer. See that right there? Okay, that's either a UFO or a Mexican sombrero. But it's 1478, and that hangs in the Louvre in France. And I went to France too and didn't know this was there until I did the research for this presentation, and I could have gone and seen all of this stuff. So there's another one. Okay, this one, when I saw it, I didn't know what it meant. But what it is this was in a newspaper in Germany, in Nuremberg. It's called the Nuremberg Gazette. And it was on the morning of April 14th, 1561. The citizens of Nuremberg woke up to an air battle between UFOs. So that's what all of the arrows and stuff in the sky are depicting, and right there you see a UFO that crashes. And this was written up in the Gazette paper in Nuremberg as a fight between 2 aircraft in the sky. And that's the way they described it. They didn't call it UFOs, but it was some aircraft in the sky that were raging a battle. Now this one, I know what that looks like. This is in Geneva in 1608, and I don't know about you, but it looks like a fort with cannons, and they're firing on UFOs hovering above the water. Does it look like anything else to you? That's what it looks like to me, is 3 craft hovering over the water, and they're firing cannons at it. Okay, now think about it. This is the timeline that I'm giving you through the Renaissance period, et cetera, of these paintings, and this is what's out there. And like I said, you'll get a skeptic like Joe Nickel or somebody that's going to tell you that's something else. Those are canoes, and they build round canoes, and they're firing at them. He'll just tell you something. Okay, let's move on from the paintings now, and let's take a ride over to the Middle East. And they have these alien-looking creatures with big eyes. Okay, and you got to wonder why they carve this stuff. And it really, when you think about it, when you look at Anubis and all of those creatures, humans with animal heads, what if it was a genetic engineering program? You want to keep the people under your control? Well, walk out an 8-foot creature with a human body and a lion's head that talks or something like that, if they're able to do that type of genetic engineering, and you'll have full control over those people, But these are the type of things that they depicted a lot in the Middle East and in Egypt, and you can go see it. Some sort of creature with big bug eyes. This is interesting. These are coins that were made in France in 1656. And again, in the back there, that one, the back of the coin, looks like a UFO with porthole, windows. And that's what it looks like. It looks like a craft to me. Now this one here, I'm probably stretching the imagination a little bit, but if you look at this, this is going to compare satellites to some ancient art. If you look at a Telstar satellite, okay, and you look at an incense burner, okay. Now let's look at some artwork that depicts it. Kind of looks like maybe a satellite. Not sure what that is. Oh, here we go. We have antenna. Why would they have antenna? Did they have radios? Why would they depict something that shows antennas on them? That's what they drew. I don't know what else that could be there. That clearly looks like an antenna. If you look at the top, there's that little round thing up top. That's what they made. Okay, here you got a slide. You got Michael Tellinger. He's in South Africa showing you a gigantic footprint. We'll talk about the Droper stones that you see on the right and other ancient locations that you see on the bottom. Okay, this is the Star Child. 1930, it was found. It was a 900-year-old skull found in Mexico. It's a 5-year-old male with a very thick skull, no sinus cavity, and the optic nerve canal is located in the bottom instead of the rear of the eye socket. DNA testing revealed that much of the DNA really had no significance because you got to use mitochondrial DNA, which is only in females. So this is a male, so you really can't get the genetic line on that because only women carry the history through their mitochondrial DNA. Males do not. And there's a lot of people who say that this is, an extraterrestrial skull. Others will say that it's just a deformity, a human deformity. I know Lloyd Pye has a lot to say on this because he's in possession of it. This is an interesting story. This is a 1,000-year-old gold-crafted airplane found in Central America. It was displayed at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. until engineers built a scale model of it and found out that it flies. It was immediately taken down from the Smithsonian. This is 1,000 years old. They thought it was a gold insect. That's what they thought it was, until some genius looked at it and said, well, insects don't have rudders on the back that stick straight up in the air. Planes do. Now think about that. That is an airplane, and it's 1,000 years old, and it's proportionally in the right size to fly. And they've put little engine on it, made it, put a little engine with a propeller, and the thing flew in the air. It's a correct size to fly. And the fact that the Smithsonian took it down Why wouldn't they leave it up? They were selling little trinkets in the gift shop of that. And I've seen ufologists with the little pin that has that on it. I think Giorgio on Ancient Aliens has a pin that has that on it. You know, why take it down? Because it will make you question whether we're the most advanced civilization on this planet, or whether that you know, our evolution or our whatever happens to us is on a cyclical cycle, and we kind of keep getting knocked back every 26,000 years, like the Mayans say, from a natural disaster. You know, they say, well, we'll get to the Mayans later. I don't want to get into my 2012 stuff. All right, this is Australia, and these are carvings that you see 5,000 BC. So they're, you know, 6,000, 7,000 years old in Australia. I don't know, are they ghosts? Are they UFOs? You know, even when you look at the whole ghostly phenomenon, where do they come from? There's another dimension. Well, maybe UFOs are interdimensional. Maybe it's not interplanetary when you try to explain all of this. But what you see there in Australia, they call it the Wandjina. And I'll tell you a little bit about it. In 1838, a party was led by Captain George Gray, who stumbled upon these paintings in Kimberley. He was exploring the Prince Regent River, and he found a number of these cave drawings and paintings. The Aboriginal people there tell the tale of the legend of the silver bird, where they say that long ago, far back in time, a great red-colored egg-shaped craft came down from the skies. It tried to land safely on the ground, but broke apart and crashed, and out of it emerged white-skinned people. And this is very similar to the tale that the Mayans tell of Kukulkan, who rose up out of the ocean. He was a white-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed man with an elongated skull, and he gave them all of their knowledge of astronomy, of the calendar that they made, of medicine. They went from Stone Age to building expansion bridges overnight. So that's a very, very similar story there. Okay, this is in the United States, 4,000 years ago, 2000 BC. It's in Utah. It's in the Sago Canyon rock area. And again, you know, you're talking about 4,000 years old. What were the people seeing that they were drawing these type of pictures? Okay, let's head over to Kiev and Italy and Ecuador. All right, these are little carvings on the right and left that look like men in spacesuits that you found in Kiev and Ecuador. Very much looks like a guy wearing a helmet and some sort of suit that's 6,000 years old. And a lot of this stuff goes back to the Old Testament, let's say, that was written 6,000 years ago. Something happened in 4,000 BC, 6,000 years ago, because a lot of these stories and a lot of it goes back to that same time frame. And the one in the middle is from Italy, 10,000 BC. It looks like some sort of guys wearing helmets, and that's what was on the cave drawing. Okay, this is Abydos, Egypt. In this plate that was in one of their pyramids, it sits up high, like over the doorway right above it is this plate, and in it is 5 airplanes. This is 4,600 years old, from 2600 BC, and if you look, you see a helicopter in the middle. To your right of it, I don't know, that could be a submarine. You see another type of aircraft below it and another one below that. But there's 5 different types of airplanes or craft in this. And I don't know, you look at that helicopter right in the middle. It looks like what it is. It's a helicopter. Okay, here's Iraq. You see the bug-eyed type drawings. In the middle there, you see that one's from Nepal, and the one on the right, again, in Africa, 8,000 years ago, you have some creature wearing a helmet and some craft or something in the sky above him. And the one in the middle is called the Lolodov plate. It was discovered in Nepal, dates back to 7,000 BC. Shows a hovering disk, a small being, a gray alien, and spiraling pattern that refers to the sacred geometry of creation.
Is that a Dropo stone? Or?
No, it's called a Lolodov plate, and it's not the Dropa stones, but we will get to that. Okay, this is 1660. It's just a Dutch drawing made by Admiral Blauw and depicts some sort of craft flying in the sky. Okay, this is the Perry-Rees map from 1513. This is an interesting story. It was found in Constantinople in 1929. It's drawn on gazelle skin. Okay, it's from 1513. It's a Turkish map that was made by Admiral Perry-Rees, and it shows an accurate drawing of Antarctica 300 years before we discovered Antarctica. So we didn't discover Antarctica until 1813, and this was discovered in 1513, and it shows Antarctica, which would be this area over here. I know it's a little hard to see. Now, the coastline of Antarctica.
What you're seeing is the oceans in the middle and the ships coming up against the coast.
Right. And then that would be on your left would be the coastline of Antarctica. And Antarctica was not ice-free since 4000 BC. So here we got that 4000 BC again. 6,000 years ago something happened. Antarctica was free of ice in 6000 BC. All right? And that was the only time you could have mapped Antarctica without the ice. But yet the Perry-Rees map shows Antarctica correctly. I wish I had one where I could take the real Antarctica without ice and put it on top of this. It is about 95% correct of where the shoreline goes, and it matches up. And, Admiral Perry-Rees said that, at the time that this was a map that was copied from 20 older maps dating back to 400 BC. But we know that Antarctica wasn't free of ice until 4000 BC. But that's where he said he got it. Okay, let's take a look at Tibet. Again, they must have liked Mexican food. Oops, wrong one. What did I do? Hold on, go back. I want to hit the pointer. There it is. You can see something flying around there. Either they liked Mexican food or those were some sort of UFOs. Here was I show you one of Columbus's ships because in his journal he documents a UFO sighting when he was 30 miles off the coast. It's in the journal by Columbus and his navigator of the ship that there was a bright light object in the sky, and it kind of led them to the coast, and they were 30 miles off the coast, and that's in his journal. I wanted to mention also with those Mexican sombrero things there. Let's go back a little bit right there. Okay, I wanted to mention that in 2009 I read an article where Tibetan monks predicted that extraterrestrials would save the Earth. The Tibetan monks have used remote viewing for thousands of years. They predicted a regional war and increases in terrorism. They saw a nuclear war between China, India, and Russia over natural resources. They said that ETs have been watching us and will intervene, that they have intervened in the past. They will reveal themselves so that we will not be afraid, and that we are destined to see and interact with them. Man will not be allowed to alter the future or destroy this planet, and we will be more in tune with spirituality at that point. Okay, this is a cool cover from Jacques Vallée, where he wrote this book that chronicles UFOs from ancient times all the way forward. And what it depicts is Alexander the Great in 329. His armies were in India getting ready to cross a river and head into India. And it's in his journals. Two craft flew down, and they hovered down at the troops, at the elephants, and startled the horses, the elephants, and his troops would not cross any further, and he ended up turning around and going back. And he describes two objects that were flying down and harassing them. So what Jacques Vallée did is he wrote this book, Wonders in the Sky, and he depicts UFOs from ancient times. So you can see the two armies there. Now, Hammurabi also described ships in the sky, and he said that they had humans dressed in white, and that's in Hannibal, I should say, Hannibal's writings. Okay, this is just ancient Sumeria, and this may be where everything started between India and Iraq. That's just what you see there, some cuneiform writing. But, you know, a couple of things that I found out in doing my research was that Sumeria has the oldest documents, and that's this cuneiform writing. It's 8,000 years old from 6,000 BC. The oldest religion is Hindu. I don't know if you knew that or not, but that's India. So we have the oldest religion being Hindu. You had the oldest documented writings being from Iraq, ancient Sumeria. And the Sumerian documents are 3,000 years older than anything else that has ever been written. Sumeria gave us the wheel, the 12 zodiac signs, written laws, the first written language, and these cuneiform writings. There's only 150 people in the world that can translate Sumerian, and there's thousands of these tablets that have never been translated. Now, I know, Jan, you're good friends with Zecharia Sitchin, and, you know, if you follow that line, you know, the ones that he did document, you know, he talks about the Nephilim, which is mentioned in the Bible, and how we were created. And they tell a Genesis story also in these Sumerian writings, 3,000 years before the Old Testament talks about Genesis. So, you know, it makes you think there. There's 7 tablets that describe creation, similar to the 7 days of Genesis, but it also describes genetic engineering of a man by the name of Adamu, with a U on the end, and creation, destruction, and recreation of a dumbed-down human for slavery. And that Michael Tellinger, if you've ever read his book, says we were a slave species that was created on this planet, because there's been slavery on every every culture, every time period, there's been slavery. The tablet was translated in 1900 by George Smith of the British Museum. It describes the Great Flood and an ark that was built, and it's on display in the British Museum. There's another tablet that accurately shows our solar system, but with a 10th planet, and that's where Sitchin talks about the 10th planet and Nibiru and the Anunnaki. And again, this is 3,000 years older than the Old Testament. The Sumerian word astra means terrible airborne weapon, and that's the word that was used in that Hindu text. They called it an astra. And our Air Force named a project that followed stealth, we named it Astra. And the Astra, from what people say, is the TR-3B, and if you know anything about that, it's supposed to be those triangular craft that we have that uses mercury, red mercury, to fly. And if you spin and compress red mercury, it glows, it emits radiation, and it defies gravity. It reduces the mass by 89%. And if you look into the Nazi UFO program, there are old black and white film that shows them spinning and compressing mercury, the object glowing and lifting off and hitting the ceiling. So, and that's a whole nother story on the Nazi UFO program. And actually, I talk about that in the book I just published, UFOs Over Pennsylvania. Okay, this is Ezekiel in 593 BC. And what it says in Ezekiel 104 to 128, quote, I looked and I saw a windstorm coming from the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal. This was the appearance and structure of the wheels. They sparkled like chrysolite, and all 4 looked alike. Each appeared to be made like a wheel intersecting a wheel. Their rims were high and awesome, and all 4 rims were full of eyes all around them. When the living creatures moved, the wheels beside them moved. When the living creatures rose from the ground, the wheels also rose. The living creatures were in the wheels. All 4 had the face of a man. I saw that from what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal. So what is he describing in Ezekiel? And the interesting thing is when Ezekiel returned from this encounter, he had the knowledge of how to make steel. Okay, next let's get into the Dropa stones. This is, again, another interesting, really interesting story if you know anything about the Dropa stones. 1938, archaeologists working in the Himalayas discovered a grave inside a cave with 4-foot skeletons in it. They're real spindly bodies with large heads, and they thought they found a new species of ape. The only problem is apes don't bury their dead. So humans do that. Apes don't do that, and they were buried inside this cave. They found 716 grooved discs with microscopic hieroglyphic writings carved into the grooves. So think about that. Like an LP record, and if you take a magnifying glass and look in, there's all hieroglyphics inside the grooves of that. Who could have done that? And this was, even if it was done in 1938 when it was discovered, that would have been a hell of an accomplishment. But it goes back, obviously a lot longer than that. And so they took these, and the disc told of a people called the Dropa who came to Earth 12,000 years ago. They crash landed here. They were hunted down by the local tribe. It was called the Ham tribe. The Dropa were unable to fix their ship. They were later able to make peace with this tribe. The discs were sent to Moscow for examination, and they were found to hum or vibrate when they spun them. The discs were cut into granite and cobalt stone, which is very hard. You really need diamond-tipped tools to do that and create that type of hieroglyphics that were in the grooves there. The cave walls were squared and glazed as if they were cut into the mountain with high heat. On the walls, they found pictogram carvings of the sun, moon, earth, and an unidentified star system. The discs and the carvings were dated back to 10,000 BC. The interesting thing is today, the area is inhabited by 2 tribes. They're called the Ham and the Dropa, and neither are Chinese or Tibetan. They're 4'2". They weigh about 50 pounds. They're kind of pygmy in stature. They are yellow-skinned with thin bodies, large heads, sparse hair, and blue eyes. And they tell the tale of a small, gaunt, yellow-skinned man who came from the clouds long ago. They had huge heads, puny bodies, and were so ugly that the local tribesmen hunted them down on horseback. So that's the story of the Dropa. Now, I want to get back into India because we don't know a lot about this, and they reference this in that Air Force cadet manual. We talked about the Zayan. Let's talk about the Mahaprabhata right now, which also dates back to 6000 BC. Now, the documents in India, they date back to 6000 BC, but they weren't written until 1000 BC, when they had the ability to write on parchment, let's say. So it was word of mouth for 5,000 years until they were able to actually write them. Where in Iraq, it was cuneiform writing in stone. Okay, that's the difference there. So I want to read some of this from the Mahaprabhata. This is an epic poem written in Vedic India 3,000 years ago in 1000 BC. It consists of 24 verses, 200,000 lines, 8 times the size of the Iliad and Odyssey combined. It tells of a time 10,000 years ago when there were flying machines and epic battles. And they're some of our oldest written documents. And I want to read what it says. It describes Vimanas, which are flying machines. The Mahaprabhata mentions airplanes 41 times. Okay? It mentions airplanes or flying machines 41 times, and it describes a weapon known as the flame of Indra. And here's a quote, again, out of the document. It was a single projectile charged with all the power of the universe, an incandescent column of smoke and flame, as bright as the 1,000 suns, rose in all its splendor. It was an unknown weapon, an iron thunderbolt. See, they don't know how to describe it, so they can only use lightning and things that they're aware of. So that's how they're describing it back then. A gigantic messenger of death, which reduced to ashes the entire race of the Vrishnas and Hakas. The corpses were so burned as to be unrecognizable. Now listen to this. The hair and nails fell out. Pottery broke without apparent cause, and birds turned white. After a few hours, all foodstuffs were infected. To escape the fire, the soldiers threw themselves into streams to wash themselves and their equipment. I mean, that's a nuclear exchange is what they're talking about that occurred 8,000 years ago. Other texts with the Vimanas speak of these craft, the Vimanas, transporting kings and dignitaries to Peru and Borneo. So I'm reading this and I said, well, the Nazca Line's in Peru. That's why they're on the top of a mountain, and you can't explain what they're doing there, because it was the greatest honor to go from India to Peru in a flying machine, and when they saw it from up above, they knew where to land. The Vedic text describes small triangular craft, 9 feet long. They held 7 to 8 passengers. There were also larger craft that were 2 stories with windows that held 1,000 passengers. And this is all in their documents. And then there were war machines and crafts that were used to fly into outer space. So here's another quote. The arrows released by Lord Shiva appeared like fiery beams emanating from the sun globe and covered the 3 airplanes which could no longer be seen. Lord Shiva clung to the sky and threw at them rockets, spears, flamethrowers, and missiles. I think this is the interpretation of what they're reading. The sky seemed to hold 1,000 suns. Neither day or night or the points of the compass could be made out. The craft occupied by Salver was mysterious. Sometimes it was visible in the sky, sometimes on ground, and sometimes floating on water. So apparently it had some sort of stealth ability. Except this irresponsible weapon, promised to never use it again against human foe, for it might destroy the world. Now, an interesting part of this document is we took some engineers. Well, as they're reading through it, there's flight manuals on these Vimanas, and they're still in existence. And the section that talked about flight, they describe every possible angle to fly. There's 230 stanzas that deal with the construction of the craft, takeoff, forced landings, bird collisions, protection from storms, and how to switch from anti-gravity to solar power. I mean, this is something written 8,000 years ago, and that's what it says when they interpret it. That's what they look like based on the descriptions that are in those manuals. Okay, we're going to talk about this part of India right now, or shortly. According to Italian scientist Dr. Pinotta, Vimanas was similar to modern jet-propelled flying machines. He said certain descriptions of the Vimanas seem too detailed and technical in nature to be labeled a myth. He cited various texts to show that there were 32 secrets relating to the operation of the Vimanas, some of which could be compared to modern-day use of radar, solar energy, and photography. He said that the ancient flying devices of India were made from special heat-absorbing metals. He said the text also described the 7 kinds of mirrors and lenses installed above for defensive and offensive uses. The so-called mirror offered a sort of visual shield, preventing the pilots from being blinded by evil rays and the weapon used to shoot enemy aircraft down. It doesn't seem too different from what we have today called laser technology. And he's describing what he's reading in these documents. The lore of the Babylonians states that the privilege of operating a flying machine is great. The knowledge of flight is among the most ancient of our inheritances, a gift from those high above. We received it from them as a means of saving many lives. Now, what you're looking at right here is the city of Rishi in Mohenjo-Daro. It was excavated by archaeologists about 100 years ago. They found skeletons lying in the streets, some of them holding hands as if some great event suddenly overtook them. The skeletons are among the most radioactive ever found, on par with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Ancient cities whose brick and stone walls have literally been vitrified, which means they were fused together by high heat, turning them into glass, are found in that same area in India. There's no logical explanation for the vitrification of the stone forts and cities except for an atomic blast. And that's where it took place, according to the records in these 8,000-year-old documents. Furthermore, at Mohenjo-Daro, a well-planned city laid a grid with a plumbing system superior to those used in Pakistan and India today. The streets were littered with black lumps of glass. These globs of glass were discovered to be clay pots that had melted under the intense heat. With the cataclysmic sinking of Atlantis and the wiping out of this area of Rama with atomic weapons, the world collapsed into a stone age. The modern history picks up a few thousand years later. The possibility of a volcanic eruption is excluded because there is no hardened lava or ash found in this area. The brief intensive heat reached 2,000 degrees. It made the ceramic vases melt. Researchers have found strictly outlined, they found the epicenter, and they found where houses were leveled, and the destruction goes less as it goes further out. So it definitely looks like a blast zone. Dozens of skeletons found in the area with high radioactivity that exceeded normal skeleton bones by 50 times. So, the comments made, we found the ancient city of Troy a few years ago, but yet this seems to be a more significant find, and it's not mentioned. You don't really hear a whole lot about it. I'm spending a lot of time on this because it's something that we don't hear of, but it tells you, a history that we're not aware of. I'm going to skip this other quote out of the Mahabharata. It basically says the same thing about the destruction. All right, it talks, and this is important here, it talks about strong and durable must the body of the Vimana be, like the great flying bird of light material. Inside, and this is what it says, inside one must put mercury with the iron heating apparatus underneath, by means of power latent in the mercury which sets the driving whirlwind in motion. A man sitting inside may travel a great distance in the sky. The reason mercury is important is that's what Hitler was using with Kamla. They were doing experiments. They were so far ahead of us, it was incredible. At the end of World War II, we were really lucky that we had won that, because Hitler was developing jet engines. He was developing these anti-aircraft craft that used mercury to fly. So it's interesting, in an 8,000-year-old document, they're talking about mercury. And it had no other purpose but to create anti-gravity. By spinning and compressing mercury, you reduce mass by 89%. And here's another passage, and it talks about how humans had all the gifts that are now regarded as supernatural, such as telepathy. We are the descendants of a higher evolved life form, not the result of evolution from barbarians and animals. Our technology tries to replace the lost powers of our ancestors. Now think about that. We didn't evolve from apes and hominids. We didn't evolve up. We were the offspring of gods or extraterrestrials that were superior, and we inherited some of their genes. And that would explain why some people have abilities, right? Some people have telekinetics, telepathy, medium. There's a lot of frauds out there also, but people seem to have this ability. We use 3% of our DNA, 8 to 10% of our brain capacity. Maybe these other people use 20% of their DNA and 30% of their brain ability. So it really is a different way of thinking that, we're the offspring of superior beings and not evolution. And I'm deliberately leaving religion out of this, but, if you just compare evolution to maybe a de-evolution, that we were, the birth of from a more superior type creature. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about Hitler. I don't know if I have a Hitler slide in here. I might. Okay, this is interesting. The engineers took the document in 1923 and they drew the specs from it. And just like that 1,000-year-old gold plane from Central America, this is what they got, and it flies. I mean, it is absolutely can flies. That's what they were talking about, was an atomic encounter. All right, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Hitler before we move into the Nazca lines. And I'm adding Hitler into this because he had a UFO program, the Nazi UFO program. Hitler and his staff were very interested in the occult. And they sent their SS out in 1938 and 1939. They went to Argentina. They went to Antarctica. They were in search of the Vril, which they thought was a species that lived on this planet that was really like hollow earth theory, that they lived under Antarctica in that area, and that they were actually extraterrestrials that came here from years ago. Hitler also sent his SS out to get the Spear of Destiny. He wanted, the Ark of the Covenant, Raiders of the Lost Ark. I mean, that's not just entertainment. That's what Hitler was trying to do. Find the Ark, find the Spear of Destiny. He found out about these documents in India. He sent his SS there to read them, come back, brief him on it as to what was said. So they found out that mercury was used. And this is, Hitler developed V-2 rockets, pulse engines, jet engines. They actually had the atomic weapon in April before we did, 6 months before we did. They presented it to Hitler, and he said, why do I want to blow up the cities? I have a blitzkrieg. They surrender pretty easily, like the French, and I have the city. So why do I want to blow it up? He says, I don't want a big weapon. I don't want to blow the cities up. He had the atomic bomb. But luckily for us, he made a lot of bad decisions. Instead, he decided to attack Russia like Napoleon, and he lost. But these are the things they're working on. But the interesting thing is you have Hans Kammler, who was in charge of all of these secret programs for Hitler. And what happened was, at the end of World War II, Kammler loads up, they had these planes called Junket 390s. They're almost like Boeing 747s. They can go 6,000 miles on one tank of fuel. So he loads his up with all the secret programs. 1,000 U-boats, which are submarines, they're U-boats. 100 U-boats leave Europe, all heading for South America, for Argentina. Because in 1938 and 39, he knew he was going to start World War II after World War I. And he had already had a fallback plan to Argentina. He had agreements with Juan Perón, and that's all documented. Perón gave 1,000 patents to Germans that came after World War II. So what happens is Kammler just disappears. Nobody knows where he took that plane. Some people say he took it down to Antarctica. Some people say he cut a deal with the Americans and he flew to the United States for amnesty. Kammler, who's up there with Göring and Goebbels and Mengele on Hitler's staff, is never mentioned in the Nuremberg trials. The guy somehow got amnesty. So did he bring that information over to us in exchange for amnesty? All of the secret programs that Hitler had him working on. The other interesting thing is those U-boats, 100 of them leave. We captured 2 of them. U-530 had 96 barrels of red mercury, and U-977 was dumping its red mercury overboard when it was captured. Now think about this. You're fleeing Europe, Berlin just fell, Hitler was shot, killed, and you're leaving for South America. What are you going to take with you? Gold, silver, things you can barter with. They got 96 barrels of red mercury. Why would you have 96 barrels of red mercury? Red mercury is what they used in the Glock, the Bell program, when they were working on anti-gravity, in those programs. So, that is an incredible story, but it's true, and that's what happened. So what we do after that is we win World War II. We start Project Hyde. First was Project Paperclip, where we got all of the German scientists and their people that worked in these programs, and pretty much gave them amnesty to come over, work in New Mexico, gave them houses, citizenship. They formed NASA. Yes, they formed NASA. That's where we got our rocket technology from, and you can look it up. That was the start of NASA. Was these German scientists that came over with their V7 rockets at that point. So that was Project Paperclip. So 2 years later, or a year later, in 1946, we have Project High Jump. Now, this project is Admiral Byrd. And here's something else. Admiral Byrd flew over Antarctica, 1929. 1938, he's invited to Germany to speak in front of Hitler and his people before we knew Hitler, for what he was going to be. And Hitler wanted to know all about Antarctica, because Hitler believed in the Vril society that lived there. So he was already gathering his information. So now it's 1946. We put Admiral Byrd in charge of Operation High Jump. He takes 4,700 troops, 23 planes, 13 ships, including the aircraft carrier Philippine, and he heads to Antarctica. It's a 6-month assignment to see if we can build a military base down there, to really launch attacks over the pole instead of flying, around the equator. Let's say you just go over the pole. So he's there 2 months. There's a number of casualties. There's an article written in the El Mercurio in Argentina where Admiral Byrd is quoted as saying, they have the ability to fly pole to pole, and we need to prepare for an attack on the United States. Okay, and that's you can Google the El Mercurio newspaper from 1946. That was his interview. Other people say what he meant to say, or what he really said, was that you have the ability to fly pole to pole to launch an attack. That it wasn't this Vril society or Hitler's people that got away down there. But they stayed 2 months and they left. There were casualties, and that was Operation High Jump. 1955 is Operation Deep Freeze in Antarctica. The USS Icebreaker East Wind saw a silver bullet-shaped craft breaking through 37 feet of solid ice and flying off at incredible speeds. That's all documented that they saw it. So now an interesting quote from Oppenheimer, who was one of those German officers who came over to help us build the atomic bomb. He was asked, he was a theoretical physicist and supervising scientist of the Manhattan Project, and he was asked at a Rochester University lecture by a student, and he gave a real strange answer. The student said, was the bomb exploded at Alamogordo during the Manhattan Project the first one to be tested? Was that the first place we tested it? Oppenheimer's response was, well, yes, in modern times. And he went on to quote the Mahatma, where nuclear weapons were used 8,000 years ago. It makes you think about our true past. Are we the most advanced civilization on this planet? Or is there a cycle, like the Mayans say, where it's a natural phenomenon that kind of every time we move forward, we get knocked back to go, and we got to start all over again. So it's real interesting information here. Dr. Raymond Drake wrote a book, Gods and Spacemen in the Ancient East, and he goes on to talk about the creation story in Genesis, and he basically says that the Old Testament is a plagiarism of Hindu text. Eric von Daniken, in his Chariots of the Gods, writes, how did the Chronicle of the Mahabharata know that a weapon capable of punishing a country with 12 years of drought could exist and powerful enough to kill the unborn in their mother's wombs? This ancient Indian epic, the Mahabharata, is more comprehensive than the Bible, and even at a conservative estimate, is at least 5,000 years old. It is well worth reading this epic in light of present-day knowledge. So I wanted to bring you up on Indian knowledge because we don't hear about this stuff, and I found this all very amazing. And I think it is what it is when you read it and what they're describing. All right, let's talk about the Nazca Alliance in Peru. Now remember that one text said the greatest privilege was to fly to Peru in a Vermana, which was a craft. So you have Nazca here, which is on the top of a mountainside where they cleared the top of the mountain. The dirt from the top of the mountain that was flattened was not found on the sides of the mountain, and it was leveled, and you have these kind of landing strips on the top of these mountains in Peru. And I think it was part of that whole thing with India to fly over here. Okay, here is Lake Titicaca in Peru. This is on the top of a mountain. It's a lake, and many lights are seen entering and leaving the water. And Viracocha is said to have created humanity, and he was able to walk on water. This is Tiwanaku, Peru, in 1500 BC. Here you got stones with interlocking beams. They range, they were quarried 50 miles away, and they weigh 100 tons. Here's Cusco, Peru, 200-ton stones this time, and they're so close together you can't fit a piece of paper between the stones. Here's the Baghdad Battery. This dates back to 248 BC. It's found with copper vases. It's in the Baghdad Museum. Hopefully it's still there. It dates back about 2,500 years. And the thing that's talked about with this is if you go into the Egyptian pyramids, right? And they talk about how did they get all the way down into the pyramids. And they said, well, they had torches, right? There's not enough oxygen down there to burn a torch. And there's no soot on the ceilings from the burning of any sort of torch. So they had a way of lighting their way to get down. Even if they put mirrors, after 3, 4, 5, 6 mirrors, the light is not enough to light their way down. So the belief is that there was some sort of battery system with lights that were used to go down into these pyramids. Some other structures, well, that's the battery. This is the ancient lighthouse of the pharaohs that dates back to 280 BC. Part of it's still there. The base is still there. This is the Ark of the Covenant, 587 BC, and all kinds of powers were associated with this. Whatever was in it had some sort of magical power, and that's what Hitler was after. He thought if he can get his hands on that and the Spear of Destiny, he couldn't lose the war, and he was after these items. Okay, this here is the Babylon Tower in 2000 BC. Somehow the stone was melted and fused under some sort of high heat or electrical charge. You know, whether that was a, lightning, I don't know, but something destroyed the Tower of Babel in 2000 BC. Here's a 2,100-year-old computer that was found by a Greek sailor in the bottom of the ocean there. It's 2,100 years old. It was found in 1902 off of Crete. It has 70 gears, cogs, and wheels. It was designed to track the sun, the moon, and the planets for sailors. It has more gears than a modern watch, and it's 2,100 years old. It's some interesting stuff out there. But you don't read about this in our textbooks, and it's not taught in any of our universities, because anything that doesn't follow the line of thinking is kind of thrown aside. And we can go off on that. This is Puma Punku. You can see those stones were cut to fit together. They're razor sharp. You had to have some sort of tools in 10,000 BC to do this, because we were supposed to be in loincloths with arrows and spears chasing woolly mammoths at that time, and it doesn't appear that that's the true history. Every time we look at our history and find more discoveries, we keep pushing back our evolution, if evolution is true, because I don't think it is, and we keep pushing humans back and back and back. Well, we were fairly smart and knowledgeable in 6,000 and 10,000 BC, and it just keeps going further back instead of forward. And you don't see any modern evidence of evolution. You really don't. There's no creatures found, fossilized creatures that are halfway between what they were. First of all, how would they survive? I mean, you'd be eaten because you lost your ability to fly or swim or whatever it is, and you're laying on the beach. So you'd be hors d'oeuvres. I don't want to ruin your appetite for 11 minutes. But now get this one. You talk about the pyramids in Egypt, right? So let's take a look at this one. This here is 17,000 years old. The pyramids are said to be 4,200, 4,500 years old, even though Edgar Cayce says they're 10,500 years old. This location is 17,000 years old. The stones are 3 times larger than anything in Egypt. The average stone is 100 tons. If you take a look in Baalbek, Lebanon, Jen, did you go there?
Not yet.
Where was the place you just went to?
Göbekli Tepe.
Oh, we're going to get to that. This is in 360 BC. 4 of the stones, if you look right there, 1, 2, well, the rest of them would be the base along there. This one here that wasn't used. Those stones range between 800 and 1,000 tons. We cannot lift those stones with our modern cranes, yet they were quarried 10 miles away and brought over here to this temple to be the base.
And that's one of the foundation stones that wasn't moved, with a group of Zachariah Sitchin students in front of it.
It was quarried 35 miles away. How did they do it? And it sits 25 feet above ground. So they lifted them 26 feet and put them up there. I mean, this is the interesting. There's your Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. That's 10,000 years ago, 10,000 BC, so 12,000 years ago. And Jen had just gone there with Linda Moulton Howe and a few other people. But, you have all of these structures, and we can't explain them. This is Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm only kidding. Because I was destroyed, so there'd be nothing to see. So I figured I'd put a picture of the desert there. There it is, Sodom and Gomorrah. It's all gone. All right, a little bit of UFO humor. All right, here's King Pakal in Egypt, in the Mayan king. So this is where, during his reign, you had the Mayan calendar, you had Coco Khan, you had all of those legends. He reigned, you can see, in 830 AD. The temple of Coco Khan was completed, I think, in 950 AD. And again, the Mayans talked about Coco Khan, who came down, gave him all of these abilities: a white male, blonde hair, blue eyes, elongated skull. And he just walked out of the ocean, gave him all of this knowledge, and one day just walked back into the ocean and left and said he'd be back. The interesting thing with the Mayan calendar, they never said anything's going to happen on 12/21. They talked about a cycle of 25,800 years, and then just another cycle starts. So I went back and looked. What happened 25,800 years ago? Was the start of the Ice Age. So I went back 52,000 years. What happened one more cycle back? I couldn't find anything. So I went back another cycle, 3 cycles, to 75,000 years ago, start of another Ice Age. So something seems to happen on this 26,000-year cycle. The Mayans never said anything. It's just a cycle that has to do with the rotation of the planet. How they knew this, because it's absolutely correct. The planet wobbles as it spins. It changes 1 degree every 72 years. It takes 25,800 years to complete 1 full rotation, and you're back to the same sky you were at. That's 1 full cycle. How did these people know that 1,100 years ago? How could they figure that out? How did they know there's a black hole in the center of the universe? Because that's what they said. So there's just so much more to our history that it's kept from us. That's a drawing of King Pakal. You could see him. He's on some sort of craft here. It's blowing out exhaust. He's kind of like on a Harley back in Peru. He's on something. Some sort of drawing of him on some sort of craft or ship. Yeah, I think that was the cover of his casket. He was said to be 8 feet tall also. He was said to be a giant. The Dogon, another interesting story. The Dogons are discovered by the British, and they're in Mali, West Africa. So they're discovered, and they have this knowledge of the Sirius star system. They point to the sky. They tell us what's there. They said there's 2 stars, which you can't see, right? And then there's a dwarf star behind them that you can't see that one either. And they tell a tale of these people coming down. They were discovered in 1844, and they tell us all about that. So then, I guess probably about 100 years later, we get telescopes, and we discover that there's a twin star system there with a dwarf star that you can't see. Yet the Dogons pointed right to it, told us where it was, and said that there were people from the stars from that place that came down to them. Obviously, didn't give them any technology because they were still in grass huts and grass skirts when they were discovered. And Carl Sagan made the comment that the Dogon could not have acquired their knowledge without contact with an advanced civilization. Hopi Indians, again, a similar tale. And this was how I got into ufology, was researching my 2012 stuff and coming across these cultures that talked about people from the sky. The Hopis talked about sacred ones arriving on flying shields, very similar to what Ezekiel said with the flying wheel, what the Romans said with their fiery shields, and that a purifier named Bahana would arrive. There'd be a great flood, famine, storms, very similar to the book of Revelations. Next, I want to get into something and talk about giants. And I got some pictures to show you. I don't believe that they're real. Well, I guess they're coming up soon. This one here was called the Oud Wedge, found in Romania. It's 20,000 BC. It was found with mastodon bones. It has 12 elements. It's 89% pure aluminum with drilled holes. Okay, it has drilled holes, and it dates back 22,000 years. It was found with mastodons. Nobody can explain what was an aluminum wedge doing back then when we had spears. Now, I put the pictures in here really for entertainment because I found some on the internet, and they're pretty cool. So I want to tell you about some of these pictures. Here you have Genesis 6.4. There were giants. There were giants on earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came upon the daughters of men, and they bore children, the same became mighty men, which were the men of renown. So basically saying that some sort of extraterrestrials or gods mated with our females, and their offspring had this, advanced DNA. And those were the stories of Apollo and Hercules, and those people were the offspring of this. So that's what they're trying to say in that. The Nephilim, which Zechariah Sitchin spoke about, were mentioned twice in the Bible. In Numbers 13:32, talks about giants in Canaan, and in Genesis 6-1-4, where this quote is from. The Epic of Gilgamesh speaks of the Enkidu, who were giants and these hairy creatures. David and Goliath was a giant. This is found in Russia, was like an 8-foot skeleton from 25,000 BC, and it had all kinds of beads and stuff on it. That is a real picture of that one. I don't think this one is. I just stuck it in there because I read that in 1833 there was a 12-foot skeleton found with a double row of teeth. Okay, that one was documented. You had, I mentioned David and Goliath. Gigantopithecus was supposed to be a giant primate that stood 10 feet tall and weighed 12,000 pounds. That's a fact. Here's one from West Virginia that was, again, the picture I don't believe is real. There's a depiction from 1856 in West Virginia of a skeleton found that's 10 feet 9 inches. This one I know is not real, but it looked cool, so I stuck it in the presentation. Here's what the difference is if you look at a 6-foot man. I'm 6 feet tall, and you see the difference of 15 feet, 8.5, 12. You can just see how much larger those type of skeletons would be. But the fact is, in almost every culture, you have these stories of giants. You have Mexicans and giants, having to kill these giants. You had Canaan, where the Israelites killed the giants. It's in the Bible. They speak of the Nephilim. So again, my point is, I think we have a history that we haven't been told. This picture here is Civil War. It's supposed to be a pterodactyl that they discovered. It's a thunderbird. If Stan Gordon's in the audience, he's our expert on these creatures, so you could speak to him. He talks about that in his presentations. Okay, so where do we come from? Is it evolution, right? Is it creation, or is it genetic engineering? And I'm gonna have to leave that up to you. I like when I look at the movie Planet of the Apes, the old one with Charlton Heston. And you remember the simian leaders when Charlton Heston found that doll that was able to speak, and he finally told the truth that they would protect their knowledge, that they were there before the humans, and the humans were never able to speak, even though it wasn't the truth. And it's whoever wrote that movie was foreshadowing and telling us a message that we do the same thing. And when the CIA got involved with UFOs in 1953 with the Robertson panel, they did a great job. I mean, the CIA is something else. They're good at what they do, and they pretty much made ufology a joke, and that was their goal, to debunk it, to make fun of it, and make fun of anybody that speaks about it. And that's why my goal is to make it comfortable for you to come forward and report a UFO. And that's why our UFO sightings have gone from 95 to 300 consistently for the last 4 years, because we do these type of presentations and we don't treat it as a joke. That's my 2012 book with the Mayans. Okay, somebody drew that. Drano is the guy. This is a new book I just wrote. It came out Friday. UFOs over Pennsylvania. It's 580 pages, 90 pictures. It's $20. There's 35 authors in it. I wrote 21 of the 35 chapters. 14 authors wrote the other chapters. There's about 30 position statements by ufologists in the field. So the cool thing with this book is, if you purchase it, it has all the history of Pennsylvania by towns. There's police sightings. There's quotes. There's a lot of cool information in this book. But the cool thing is, you can take it. You can get my signature. You can get Stan Gordon's. On any given conference you come to, there's 4 or 5 contributors to this book. Bob Gardner, when Bill Burns is here, he's speaking in Philly in 2 weeks. He wrote chapter 12. Tom Carey's going to speak next year. He wrote a chapter. So if you want, you can get yourself 20 signatures in this book. Bring it back every year to the conference. And, it's a cool book, 580 pages. It's only $20. So I do want to say that I believe in God, but I don't believe we've been told the whole story. This stuff does not add up. And, you have to wonder, when we're told humans are around 50,000 years, and you find footprints that are 250 million years old. You find jewelry and vases in coal deposits that are 250,000 years old, before humans were even supposed to be around. Gold jewelry, right, and vases in the coal deposits. Where did they come from? So it's all left up to your interpretation. Some of the pictures there at the end were really for entertainment purposes. Maybe one of those giants were real. I don't think the others were, but they're documented in the Bible and other locations. So I just want to open up your mind that I don't think we've been told the whole story. There's a lot more to our past, and I'm leaning towards us really being de-evolution as opposed to coming from apes and chimps, which I don't believe for 1 minute. So at this point, we're going to walk out those doors and have a cocktail hour. And there's food being served on trays by waiters and waitresses. Hopefully you'll buy your Pennsylvania book. I wrote it, 580 pages. I'd like to sell them. Thank you.